Hi, guys, and welcome to day 3 of our World War II notes in America at War class. Today, we're going to really especially focus on Europe and D Day in particular. So, I want to just talk about one thing before we get into D Day. So, if you go, I will have some slides that maybe you don't have, so just be aware of that. I'm going to back up, and we should be starting on a slide that says Vichy France. And it just didn't fit anywhere else, so I just need to talk about it, and then we'll move into D-Day. I think we mentioned this before, but remember that some of these countries that were occupied were kind of split on their loyalty, and France was one of those. And the people that were loyal to the French were called Vichy French, and most of them lived down in the south of France. You'll notice it's a pretty large area, actually. So they tended to work with the Nazis, whereas the Northerners tended to work with the Allies from London. It's happened in Holland. It happened all over the place. And I can't even imagine what they did to the people after the war was over. I know by talking to some of my relatives that were there, the women, if they slept with the Germans, they shaved their heads and exiled them basically and said, "You have to leave." A lot of the guys, they just shot, plain and simple. And I want to just tell you a family story. So I had a great uncle who was in Holland during the war, and his parents helped some of the Jews escape. And what they would do is they would hide the Jewish kids, especially, in the beds with their children. So when the Nazis would come to search their apartment, they would put them and have them sleep between the legs of their son or daughter in their bedroom. And then they would just say, "Sure, come in and search, just please don't bother the children, they're sleeping." Well, it just so happened that their neighbor was a Nazi informant. And my great uncle watched as the Nazis came and took his mom and dad away. They were brought to a camp, and he never saw them again. They were killed. So my uncle was about 10 years old when that happened, and he immediately joined the resistance in Holland and did a lot. And at the end of the war, can you guess what he did to his neighbors? You bet. He shot him, and he openly told me that. I mean, they killed his parents. So a lot of those people ended up dead. Again, it depends on who wins the war, right? Okay, so now let's go into D-Day a little bit. The first thing I want you to do is take a look at this picture. I know you don't have it, but one of the things that really shocked me when I visited Normandy was how absolutely huge it was. And we visited there actually the same time of the month and the same time of day that the attack happened. And when the attack happened, the tide was out. And I think the thing that shocked me the most was how far they had to go. This is actually a memorial on one of our beaches. Take a look at how far out the water is. And then imagine that there are guys up on a hill behind a pillbox that are shooting at you and throwing bombs at you, and you're trying to cross this entire beach, and you have nothing to hide behind. It really showed me how tough it was. I remember the first time I saw this beach, I just stood there and cried because I just couldn't even imagine a task that big. Now, there was only one thing that they could hide behind, basically, and those were what we called Belgian hedgehogs. They were actually German defenses, because now remember, the tide is out, but when the tide is in, these things are covered with water, and they were designed to basically pop holes in the bottom of your boats so that they couldn't come into shore. That was the idea, but really that's all they had to hide behind as they were getting shot at. They also, the Germans buried explosives everywhere along the beach. In fact, they are still finding explosives today that are buried in certain places. So thousands and thousands. They also, of course, had pillboxes up on the hill. So they were very well fortified and protected. You saw in our video how hard it was in the Pacific to try to take out the guys in those pillboxes. So it was very difficult. All right, so let's talk about Operation Overlord, or D-Day. Operation Overlord is the code name, of course. If you take a look at our three guys up here, this is FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, and they met secretly to plan this invasion across the English Channel that you see right here, okay? And they decided they were going to attack at Normandy Beach. Now, the Germans expected them to attack elsewhere. In particular, they thought they would attack at Calais, right here, because it's a lot shorter distance than over here. We also sent a lot of subterfuge to make them believe we were coming from Norway up here, excuse me. So let's show you some of the stuff that was making them believe those things. This is called Operation Bodyguard, and basically the goal was to keep the Germans guessing and keeping them spread out so that the Normandy invasion will not have as much resistance. This plan was designed by the British and the US, and it is absolutely brilliant. So take a look at some of the stuff that they did. Each of these has its own code name, by the way. So like Fortitude North was basically sending all kinds of secret information by double agent spies and information over the radio saying that we are trying to free Norway. This next movement was basically to convince neutral Sweden to help us invade Norway, and also to convince Sweden, Spain, and Turkey to side with us in the war, which really made them think, why are you trying to take Norway? There must be a reason. Maybe we're going to use that to invade Germany. Fortitude South was the fake attack at Calais, France. Now remember, this is where they thought we would probably attack because it's the shortest distance. I will talk to you in detail about that attack on another slide. Okay. The next one is Operation Ironside. Through double German agents, they basically played on the Germans' fears of an attack at Bordeaux, France. So a lot of information was being told to Hitler about Bordeaux. This next one is one of my absolute favorites. They basically hired an actor who looked just like General Montgomery, the head of the British command, and they put him down in North Africa so that the Germans would think maybe we were going to attack from North Africa. Down below here, we had a threat of invasion from North Africa, and we would send information through our spies and through the radio. And we also sent information that said we were coming from the Balkans. And again, if we're taking Italy and the Balkans and that area, why not? So all this stuff was being fed to the Germans, and they didn't know quite where we were coming. We also used a great thing like right as the attack happened. This is called Operation Titanic, and we basically dropped a bunch of dummies that looked like paratroopers from the ground. They were about 3 foot tall, these guys that you see over here, and they were filled with sand and hay, so they were heavy like a human, and some of them were made to combust when they landed, so they would explode and take out some of the enemy. That was the hope anyway, or take out fortresses. There were 500 of them dropped in northern France. You see the picture right here, to keep them guessing. The Brits called their guys Ruperts, and the U.S. called these guys Oscars. They look a little bit different, you'll notice. And the other thing that happened is planes flew back and forth in northern France, and they dropped windows, which you see down here in the corner. They're basically a bunch of strips of tinfoil. And when they did that, it basically made one plane look like 10 planes. So they thought there was a whole invasion of planes up in northern France. They then jammed the German radio when the actual planes came through. So some great thinking on the part of our allies. Now, another thing we had to do was figure out how to break the code, right? We saw a little movie on movie night, U571, where we're trying to capture the Enigma machine, right? So here's some information on that. In the spring of 1944, the Allies had already decoded the German Enigma machine through MI6, basically the CIA of England. There were a huge number of deaths trying to capture this machine, especially in the Navy, but they kept trying. British sailors actually ended up going onto a German sub to track down the Enigma, and that's kind of how we got our advantage. And that's the story that you saw in the movie in U571. They also ended up with some brilliant minds coming together, led by Alan Turing up here. I don't know if any of you have seen The Imitation Game. And he basically created a machine that would decode the Enigma. It's fascinating. This is the machine that you see right here. Now, MI6 could not allow the Germans to know they had decoded the Enigma, or they would basically change to another system, and we would have to start all over again from scratch. So they did have to allow certain successes. For example, we talked about this the other day, that, if you have turned every German agent, do you allow some of them to be shot? Because Hitler would expect that, or he would assume we've turned them. Do you give Hitler information about a ship that's leaving or an attack that's going to happen in certain places? Because if not, he's not going to believe anything from his spies. So we have to be able to have some good, valid information. The truth is, they did give some of that information, and it did end up killing some of our people. In fact, it killed one of the brothers of one of the guys that made this decision at MI6. This information, by the way, didn't come out until 50 years later, but some really tough decisions. Some other deception. This was called the double cross system or the double X system. Also, at the same time, they had also turned all the German secret agents into double agents through MI6. So again, the committee that controlled what information was true and when was false and what they released was called the 20 Committee or the double X system. We even used this cartoon, Mutt and Jeff, about fake invasions of Normandy D-Day attacks. So it's amazing the things they looked at. And again, what would you do? Would you kill some of those agents even though they've turned and become loyal to the United States? Tough decisions to make. All right, so let's take a look at Operation Fortitude North, the attack on Norway. And again, it's to keep everybody spread out so that we have a chance at Normandy. So this relied on 5 parts. Number 1, physical deception. So they started using dummy landing crafts, airfields. They had these huge blow-up planes and tanks and landing crafts. They're just amazing because they look very real. We'll show you. Well, this is one right here. This is a blow-up plane right there. Number 2, controlling leaking information. Number 3, wireless traffic to create pretend units. Number 4, the use of German double agents to give them information. And then the presence of very important people with these phantom groups, like Patton, that we'll talk about coming up. So here is Calais. Notice Calais is 25 miles apart. Here where we actually attacked is 35 miles. So they assumed that we would probably attack at Calais. Now, we talked about the inflatables. Here are some of those. Here's an inflatable truck and a tank that you see they can hold up in the air. And they put a whole bunch of them right over here by Calais. Not only did they do that, but they sent Patton, the real Patton, over here up across from Calais. The truth is he had just gotten in trouble. He had disobeyed an order. And so they sent him up there as punishment. But it was also because Hitler was watching those big dogs. And he thought, well, if Patton's there, they must be attacking there. And then they created a fictitious 1st U.S. Army group up there with him. So he was leading his troops for this attack. In fact, Hitler delays sending troops at Calais for 7 weeks, assuming there's going to be another attack there because of this very plan. So it was very successful. Kind of cool. All right, some other things to know about Normandy and the attack on D-Day. Number 1, it is the largest amphibious invasion in all of World War II. It happened on June 6th, 1944. Now, I have a question for you. Some of you know that it was supposed to happen on June 5th. Why didn't it happen on June 5th? You're right. We had cloud cover and we wouldn't have been able to see our drop zones. So they changed it to June 6th. And it was either then or nothing because they had cloud cover coming later on or bad weather. Prior to the Normandy landings on D-Day, the Allies knew the locations of all but 2 of Germany's 58 Western Front divisions. So they really had some good information. This included 150,000 Allied soldiers, 600 warships. It was General Eisenhower versus Rommel, basically in Germany. By July, the result, the Allied forces were in France, and we had over 1 million troops in France pushing the Germans back. Now, one of the parts of the plan was the airborne. Now, remember that airborne were a brand new thing in World War II. In World War I, we jumped out of balloons, but it was a little different. This is where we're using troops that are actually attacking with parachutes and all of that. These were the best of the best. If you look at the percentage that dropped out in training, it's absolutely insane. They got better pay than the other guys because it was danger pay. I mean, they're jumping out of planes every day. And we did. We had guys that died in training. We still do, but not as many as we did back then because it was a new thing. The German paratroopers, they had a group as well. They were called this word, and I'm really bad at it, so I'm not gonna say it for you because I'm horrible at German. The Allies called them Green Devils because of what they wore. You see them right over here. If you'll take a look at the guys and what they wore over here, they had a lot of weight on them because they carried everything with them. Remember, the Army goes from base to base. They have a headquarters. But the paratroopers are flying in, right? So they have everything they need on their body. And if you've seen Band of Brothers, you know that that's a story about the paratroopers, especially on D-Day and then following them across Europe. So the paratroopers were dropped in the night before. There were 17,000 paratroopers that were dropped. And you'll take a look at just some of the numbers here. We also had almost 4,000 glider troops that were dropped, 5,700 air crew that were involved. Remember that they could basically take 28 paratroopers in one C-47. Now, if you look at the casualties, these are just paratrooper casualties. Over 1,000 killed, 2,600 wounded, 4,400 some missing, if you can believe that. So it was rough stuff for these guys. These are the gliders, and a lot of people don't know about the gliders. There were actually almost 4,000 gliders that we used. If you look at the top box here, you can see that this glider could carry 9 troops and 1 pilot if you use this one. This one was most common, and this carried 28 troops, 2 pilots, or it could carry 2 pilots and 2 jeeps, or 1 jeep and 1 artillery piece. And you notice that they basically get towed by a C-47. And they go basically from 120 miles per hour, from 0 to 120 in like seconds. It's really crazy. And then they would let them go and they would just glide in. That was the idea. But unfortunately, as you can see down here, the Germans were ready for those gliders. They basically flooded a lot of the area. So they ended up crashing in the water and drowning. They also put these posts up. They called them Rommel's asparagus so that our gliders would crash into those and die. And then, of course, you have your hedgerows, those bushes, that would also be tough, and they would crash into those as well. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the map of Normandy so you can get a big picture of where all these guys are going. So remember, the airborne are dropped in the night before. There were 3 groups. We had the 82nd Airborne dropping up here by St. Mary Glees. We had the 101st Airborne dropping over here by Carentan. And if you've seen Band of Brothers, this is that group right here. And then you have the British 6th Airborne down here by Caen. Okay. Now their goal was basically to clear out the roads and the pathways so that our guys would not get stuck on the beach. And then the guys that are attacking on the beach, the next morning, the Americans, the 4th Division's attacking at Utah. The 1st is at Omaha. The Canadians, the 3rd Division, are at Juneau. And then the British 50th Division is at Gold, and the 3rd Division is at Sword. And in class, I actually got to show you guys some of the sand and let you touch it, see what it feels like. Before the paratroopers left, the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, actually met them and shook hands with them because he knew that this was a crucial attack and that these guys were really important, and they were doing a very difficult task. He said, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the greatest crusade towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you." Gives me goosebumps. So I'm not going to click into this, obviously, but you can. If you click into this, You'll get some of the paratroopers' experiences and what it was like on D-Day as they were being dropped. And unfortunately, they were dropped all over the place because they were getting flak. And so they dropped them wherever they could at whatever heights they could. And a lot of them had to walk. Some of them dropped in the river. Some of them dropped into enemy territory. So it was a tough day for our paratroopers. And then the next day, we have the beach attack. The goal of Operation Overlord is to drive the Nazis out of France and start pushing into Germany. It was the largest amphibious invasion. It was a 60-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. Altogether, it's called Normandy. Hitler was caught unaware. He thought the attack would be further up at Calais. 326,000 soldiers land the first week, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. And there were actually 3 waves that came in on the beach. If you take a look at our numbers, you'll notice the Germans are outnumbered 3-1. But they're heavily fortified and they're entrenched, and they have the advantage of height as well. At least 10,000 casualties for the Allies, 4,400 confirmed dead, etc. Germans, we never really know the exact number. Hitler didn't really want anybody knowing how many were dying, but they had horrible casualties as well. We've already covered this information. Just remember that this is Eisenhower versus Rommel that are leading the attack, basically. Come on. There we go. This is one of those ducks that we talked about, or LCVPs. They were brought up to the water, and it was an amphibious attack, like we said. But unfortunately, we didn't always practice everything in the exact conditions. So, for example, the ducks dropped them off too far out, some of them, and the guys dropped off with their packs and ended up drowning because we had never tried it out that far out in the water. And as that door went down, these machine guns up here just killed a lot of guys. So I would highly recommend you watch this video. It shows both the American and the German perspective at D-Day, and it interviews real veterans that were there. It's really interesting. Now, if you look up pictures of D-Day on the beach, you will find there are very few pictures of the dead. There were so many people dead that they said you couldn't step without stepping on a body around you. And they just kept coming, and they just kept coming, and there was more and more and more. So they agreed that they would not release pictures of the dead on D-Day. It just was out of respect for those that had fallen. So in September of 2013, some people got together and decided that they wanted to really get a picture of what it was like to see that fallen 9,000. And they call it the fallen 9,000. So they decided to get stencils and basically scrape the outline of humans on the beach. You see them doing that here. That's what it looks like. And that is what it looks like if you go all the way down the beach. And it also goes further the other direction. So it really gives you an idea of how many people fell on that day. All right, our next battle is called the Battle of the Bulge. This took place December 16th of 44 to January 25th of 1945. So we're talking over a month in the worst weather, the coldest weather. And most of these guys are wearing basically a jean jacket with no boots, no gloves. A lot of the guys got frostbite, lost toes. It was a horrible situation. You'll notice that the border goes along these 3 countries. It goes through Luxembourg, France, and Germany. Hitler threw everything he had at this attack. This was his big push. He threw everybody, his tanks, his planes, to try to break this line. Now, why is it called the Battle of the Bulge? Do you know? Yes, I bet you do. Because the Germans pushed us so far back, you'll see here in the picture, that they pushed a bulge in the line. And that's why it's called Battle of the Bulge. The guys out here are spread so thin and the conditions are so bad. It's truly amazing that they held. And had they broken through, we probably would have lost the war. Now, the guys you've seen in Band of Brothers were the 101st, and they are right here. So notice they are completely surrounded. They're also cut off from any hospitals or first aid stations. So our medics are dealing with really hard times because they're taught just to stop the bleeding, basically, right? And get them to a hospital or an aid station. And they didn't have that capability. It is the US, Britain, France, Canada, Luxembourg resistance versus Germany. The result, the Allies held the line through horrible conditions and casualties. Because of this, the Germans begin retreat, and this kind of signals their defeat. They risked so much and so many people and so many weapons in this push that they're really on the down spiral at this point. This is the first time Allies will enter Germany since the war has begun in 1930-something for Europe, 41 for the US. It is also the first time Allies will see concentration camps and actually believe the things that they've heard. I mean, imagine if someone told you that people were putting all blonde-haired girls in a camp and killing them and putting them in ovens today in the US. Think about what you would believe. You would think it's got to be a lie, right? Because how could anybody be that evil? And it wasn't until they actually sent pictures of the things they saw that they realized that this was really happening. If you'll take a look, here are the groups and the leaders that were involved. You'll notice a lot of big names, and there's somebody missing. We're missing Rommel, who was basically Hitler's right-hand man. So the question is, where is he? Interesting story. Well, remember that there were at least 7 attempts to kill Hitler. It wasn't like they weren't trying, but none of them succeeded. The recent bomb assassination attempt on Hitler was some of Rommel's friends, and they were involved. So he basically kind of stood up to Hitler and said, you know what, I really think we need to surrender. The truth is actually Rommel was against the bomb assassination. He wanted him arrested because he was worried about martyrdom, that actually if he died, people would make him a hero. So because he stood up to Hitler, he was arrested. Now, Hitler didn't want people to see that he was a traitor because that was bad for morale. So he basically gave him 2 choices. He said, number 1, you can be tried in court and executed, and they would execute his family as well. Or number 2, he could commit suicide by taking a cyanide pill, which all Nazi officers carried, by the way. And as you can imagine, he chose suicide to save his family's life. He wanted no Nazi regalia on his coffin. That was one of his last requests, but that was not honored, as you can imagine. He is the only Nazi official with a museum today, and his African Corps, who is still alive, still visits his grave. Those that are alive anyway. Take a look. The Battle of the Bulge included more than 1 million men. Take a look at the casualties. American casualties, 89,500 casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing, 800 tanks. Take a look at the British numbers. The Germans, again, had about the same amount of casualties, 600 tanks, hundreds of aircraft. 3,000 civilians killed. It was just a horrible mess. Why is this important? Again, this is the turning point in the war. This is the end of the German offensive. Now, there's 2 little clips that I would recommend that you watch. One of these, well, they're both actually from Band of Brothers. So I'd recommend that you just look up on YouTube Band of Brothers clips from the Battle of the Bulge, and you'll see what it was like. I want to talk about one more thing in Europe, because I think sometimes we get the idea that every American battle was a victory, and it wasn't. And sometimes it's not big battles, but it's little battles that are the most brutal to some of these men. This is called Operation Market Garden, or the Battle at Arnhem. It went on from September 17th to the 26th of 44, and this was in Holland. The goal, the Allies are fighting to liberate Holland, free them, and find a route into Germany. It was the British Airborne, aided by the U.S. Airborne, and then it was against the German SS. Now remember that the SS are like the best of the German troops. They're the Navy SEALs, you might say, of their group. They went on what's called Hell's Highway, and they basically fought town to town, like liberating each town. And if you talk to one of my veterans who has passed away, he's one of my favorite guys, Kurt Eggers. He tells a story about his worst day, and his worst day was on Hell's Highway because he lost a lot of friends that day. And he remembers they were clearing houses, and you took turns about who went first, right? And in this particular day, his buddy went first, he went second. His buddy ended up getting killed and he survived. And he said, to this day, I don't understand why I survived. And he died because it should have been me, you know. It did not go well. The airborne loses 3/4 of their men in this particular attack. And it does not go well at all. Take a look at our numbers. Number of deaths and casualties that you see here. Here's the route that we're talking about. It was a failed Allied invasion. And the Allies basically have to find another way into Germany because this one does not work. The sad part of this is they would see these Dutch people just so thrilled and thankful that they had finally been freed since the 1930s. Remember, this is 44 now, right? And they're so thankful. And then once they got past them, the Germans would take over that town again. And they would actually get punished for working with the Allies. So it was a very sad part of the war. Okay, we're going to stop here for today, and we'll do part 4 on the end of the war. So have a great night and get some sleep. We'll see you later.